The first American soldiers to face the logic of water did not do so with textbooks or blueprints, but with soaked uniforms and trembling hands. In the muddy shallows west of Matur, Tunisia, the army discovered that a mechanized force could not advance 1 mile without its engineers. The infantry could storm hills, the tanks could crush wire, but when a river stood in the way, the battle stopped cold. Every division that tried to cross without engineers learned that water could fight harder than men. In the spring of 1943, the 27th Engineer Battalion attempted to bridge a tributary of the Moselle River after a German rear guard blew the culverts. The current tore at their rubber pontoons, turning them sideways like leaves. The assault boats drifted off course, carrying infantrymen into the open under enemy fire. A sergeant shouted for anchors. Another tried to steady a cable line with his own body weight. The battalion commander, watching from the near bank, scribbled a note that became doctrine: reconnaissance before pontoons, smoke before steel. That short sentence was worth more than any medal. It meant that every crossing would begin with an engineer reconnaissance team, men crawling to the riverbank with measuring tapes, range rods, and grease pencils, noting width, depth, current speed, bank height, and soil type. If the far bank was too steep, they would call for bulldozers before the first truck rolled. If the current ran faster than 6 feet per second, they would plan double anchorage. To the untrained eye, it looked like clerical work. To the trained one, it was survival math. When the army moved from Tunisia to Sicily in July of 1943, the lessons followed. German and Italian sappers had perfected the art of delay. One well-placed charge beneath a masonry arch, and an entire regiment halted. At Nicosia, retreating troops dropped 3 spans in a night. At dawn, American engineers arrived, studied the rubble, and sent for Bailey panels. Within 24 hours, trucks and tanks rolled across what had been a crater. It was not a miracle, it was a system. The British had invented the Bailey Bridge, a modular lattice of steel panels pinned together with connecting posts. 4 men could carry a panel. 20 could build a 50-foot bridge. No cranes, no rivets, no welding. The Americans embraced it with a zeal that startled even its creator, Donald Bailey. Workshops in Birmingham, Pittsburgh, and Detroit began producing panels faster than the Royal Engineers could draw up orders. By the end of 1943, every U.S. engineer regiment carried Bailey components as standard load 40-foot sections, stacked on 2.5-ton trucks, pinned and numbered for instant assembly. But the Bailey was only part of the story. Across every beachhead and river mouth came other shapes of steel and rubber: M2 pneumatic pontons, DUKW amphibious trucks, treadway sections, and assault boats. The M2 ponton was a grey inflated bladder fitted with wooden decking, designed to flex with the current. The treadway bridge was its armoured cousin steel lanes resting on floats, capable of carrying a 30-ton Sherman tank. The DUKW, half truck and half boat, carried them wherever the army needed a bridge faster than nature could destroy one. In the Sicily campaign, at the Detonate River, engineers faced an enemy who used demolition fuses as weapons of time. Every retreating column left behind bridges wired with delay charges. Some exploded hours later, others at the first vibration of tank tracks. The engineers learned to outguess them. They sent patrols to cut firing wires in the dark, to flood detonators with mud, to throw smoke over road cuts so sappers could work unseen. When a bridge blew, the same crews that ducked the blast began building before the dust settled. One platoon commander described the rhythm of their days. "We built in hours what they destroyed in days." The trick was not courage, it was order. That order came from rehearsals. Each company practiced unloading gear in reverse sequence from the trucks. Anchor cables first, ponton floats second, decking last. Every man knew where to stand by number. A crossing became choreography timed, silent, and repeatable. There were failures still. At Gela, the surf smashed landing pontoons. At Licata, an air raid scattered bridge trucks across the beach. Yet each failure hardened the system. Engineers began to pre-stage equipment by weight and function. Every bridge site had a smoke detachment with generators burning a mix of diesel and ammonium chloride to shroud the river in a grey curtain. When German artillery found them, they simply moved downstream and started again. The doctrine that emerged by the winter of 1943 was simple but absolute. Speed beats fuses. A blown bridge delayed a column for hours. A rebuilt bridge restored it in less. If the enemy could not hold a line long enough to detonate all his charges, demolition became irrelevant. The Germans, precise to the second, counted on delay fuses and bridge mines to buy time. The Americans answered with motion: build faster, move sooner, bridge again. An after-action report from the 5th Army Engineer Section summarized it without poetry. Enemy demolitions were extensive but ineffective. Our bridging units replaced destroyed spans faster than the enemy could prepare new obstacles. The engineer is now the equal of artillery in determining the pace of advance. Behind that bureaucratic phrasing lay human endurance. An engineer corporal named James Peterson recalled driving an Monet ponton truck for 72 hours without rest, ferrying floats from Palermo to the front. "We didn't think about bravery," he said later. "We thought about torque ratios, current speed, and keeping the bolts lined up. If you stopped to think about being shot at, you'd forget which pin went where." The speed of their work astonished even their own commanders. When General George Patton demanded a bridge across the Simeto River, the order reached the 39th Engineers at midnight. At dawn, tanks rolled across a 120-foot Bailey Bridge, built in 6 hours flat. The Germans had wired the old span for demolition, but by the time their charges blew, American convoys were already on the far bank. "You can't stop a man who builds faster than you can destroy," one captured German sapper told his interrogators. "You can only run." By the end of 1943, the Army Corps of Engineers was the largest single technical body in the world. Its depots stretched from Oran to Naples, stocked with thousands of tons of bridging equipment, thousands of miles of cable, millions of bolts, pins, and clamps, all interchangeable, all standardized. No two bridges were ever identical, yet every part fit another. That was the secret, not improvisation, but precision made, portable. When the Mediterranean winter rains came, turning rivers into torrents, the engineers kept building. They learned to read the color of water for its depth, the pitch of wind for its speed, the taste of mud for its load-bearing strength. They became a breed apart half builder, half soldier, as comfortable with a slide rule as with a rifle. The German command saw in their reports a new threat. The enemy's bridging units exhibit industrial discipline, one intelligence bulletin from the 10th Army warned in late 1943. They do not hesitate before water obstacles. Demolitions lose their value. The Americans had learned their lesson in Tunisia and Sicily. Rivers were not barriers, only problems to be solved. They had learned that an army's courage mattered less than its capacity to organize chaos. And somewhere between the smashed arches of Nicosia and the flooded fords of the Simeto, a truth began to take shape that would soon carry them from the Moselle to the Rhine. In modern war, speed, not firepower, defeats destruction. A bridge built faster than it can be blown is more than an engineering feat. It is a weapon. The Moselle River near Arnaville looked deceptively peaceful. That September morning, a silver ribbon winding between vineyards and the smoke-streaked ruins of Lorraine. To the men of the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion, it looked like work. To the men of the German 47th Volksgrenadier Division, watching from the far bank, it looked like a killing ground. Between them lay 400 feet of cold, fast water and the defining test of the engineer creed: build faster than the enemy can destroy. For General George S. Patton's Third Army, the Moselle crossing was a tactical necessity and a logistical nightmare. The armoured columns had raced from Normandy to the Lorraine frontier in record time, but now the fuel trucks lagged behind, the rivers had risen, and the Germans had recovered their balance. The ponton parks were still strung out along French roads miles to the rear. Yet Patton's orders were blunt: cross the Moselle at Arnaville and secure a bridgehead for the armour within 48 hours. To fail meant to stall his entire campaign toward the Rhine. Lieutenant Colonel Emerson R. Itchner, commander of the 249th Engineers, stood on the near bank at dawn on September 10, 1944, studying the water through field glasses. The current ran 5 knots, swift enough to rip loose a ponton. The far bank was steep, dominated by German artillery in the heights near Dornot. Every textbook said to find another site. Patton's staff said otherwise. "Cross here," the order read. "Cross now." At 0600 hours, under a misty grey light, the engineers launched their first assault boats. The air filled with the drone of Nebelwerfers, the German screaming mimes. A shell burst among the first wave, flipping 2 boats. Men thrashed in the water, dragged down by wet gear. Sergeant William M. Holt of Company C swam to the overturned ponton, righted it, and paddled alone through machine-gun fire to the far bank. He became the first man of the Third Army across the Moselle. His example turned panic into motion. Within minutes, others followed, paddling through smoke laid by the 84th Chemical Battalion, who ran their generators so hot that the oil filters melted. On the far side, the infantry of the 5th Infantry Division clawed their way up the slope, bayonets fixed. Behind them came the raft's wooden decks lashed to pneumatic floats, each powered by an outboard motor sputtering gasoline fumes. Every raft trip ferried an anti-tank gun, a jeep, or a half-ton trailer. The crossing took minutes. The repair work after each shell burst took seconds. An engineer officer noted dryly in his log, "Enemy shelling heavy, repairs continuous." At D+6 hours, the first bridge section arrived a line of M2 pontoons, hauled on trucks that churned through mud like tugboats. The treadway panels clanged as they were unloaded, echoing through the valley. Enemy gunners found the range. Shrapnel tore through rubber floats, hissing air and water. The engineers patched them with tire repair kits and moved on. By mid-afternoon, the bridge was half finished and half destroyed, yet the men refused to stop. They worked kneeling, crouching, even submerged to the waist, tightening bolts under fire. Then came the counterattack. German tanks from the 11th Panzer Division rolled toward the far bank, firing blindly into the smoke. The infantry radioed for anti-tank guns, but the bridge wasn't ready. Engineers lashed together an emergency ferry from damaged floats and hauled the first gun across by hand, ropes burning through their palms. They got it there just in time. 2 Shermans followed, churning the ramp and shaking the new treadway like thunder. The Germans fell back. The engineers did not even look. Up they kept building. By nightfall on September 10, 1944, the Arnaville Treadway Bridge was complete. 350 feet of steel and rubber stretching across the Moselle. Trucks rolled over it that same hour, headlights dimmed under blackout hoods. Each vehicle groaned on the deck, flexing the steel bays, but the bridge held. Itchner's radio report to Corps headquarters was terse and proud. Bridge complete, traffic flowing both ways, casualties acceptable. Then the river rose. Rain from the Vosges swelled the Moselle overnight. The current climbed to 6 knots, pressing against the bridge like a living thing. Anchors dragged loose, floats twisted sideways. At 0400 hours, the entire center section buckled and tore free, spinning downstream in darkness. The engineers woke to a roar and the sickening sound of tearing metal. The bridge was gone. In any other army, that would have ended the operation. In Patton's army, it began a race. Itchner ordered every available man back to the bank. Replacement pontons arrived within 3 hours, still dripping mud from their previous crossing. Work lights flared. Smoke poured again across the water. By noon on September 11th, the bridge stood restored stronger, better anchored, and already carrying tanks. The German commander opposite Arnaville, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, later told interrogators, "We destroyed their bridge twice, each time it reappeared. It was like fighting a river that rebuilt itself." His sappers laid new demolition charges along the approaches, but American engineers learned faster. Patrols cleared every culvert, every ditch, every rail tunnel for hidden fuses. They carried wire cutters as standard equipment, often alongside rifles. For 3 days, the Moselle crossing became a battle of persistence. German artillery shattered the treadway. American engineers rebuilt it before the smoke cleared. When high-velocity shells punched through the decking, men crawled across with steel plates and welded patches in place while traffic waited on the near bank. The bridge was hit 47 times. It fell 3. It stood 4. In those hours, the phrase, "hold what you build," entered the core of engineers' vocabulary. The bridge was not just a structure, it was an active front line. Infantry guarded it, medics triaged beside it, artillery zeroed enemy batteries that threatened it. And through it all, the engineers worked as if in a trance, timing their hammer blows between shell bursts, counting seconds for survival. One platoon sergeant kept a stopwatch around his neck. 20 seconds between salvos meant 20 seconds to tighten bolts. When the last German guns fell silent on September 14th, the Arnaville bridge was still there, scorched, patched, and dripping with condensation. Over 9,000 vehicles had crossed in 5 days. Itchner's battalion lost 67 men killed or wounded, but every section of the bridge remained intact. Patton visited the site 2 days later, saluted the engineers, and said, "You made the impossible look routine." That routine became the template for every crossing that followed from the Saar to the Rhine. The Arnaville Bridge proved a new kind of truth, that in industrial war, the rhythm of hammers could be as decisive as the fire of guns. The Germans had trusted in demolition, the Americans trusted in reconstruction. In that contest, time itself chose sides. The side that rebuilt faster than the enemy could destroy was the side that would win. When the rivers of Western Germany froze, the war did not pause, it slowed, then boiled. The Ruhr River, running from the Eifel Mountains to the Meuse, became both weapon and wall. The Germans, retreating before the weight of the Allied advance, had turned it into a trap. Behind them loomed the great Schwammenauel and Urft dams, massive walls of masonry, holding back millions of tons of water. In February of 1945, those dams were the most dangerous fortifications left to Hitler's army, not because they could stop tanks, but because they could drown them. For weeks, American engineers watched the river rise and fall like a pulse under German control. The plan for Operation Grenade, the Ninth Army's crossing of the Ruhr, was ready by early February. The bridges were prefabricated, the treadway sections numbered, the Bailey panels staged, and ponton companies rehearsed on mock rivers in Belgium. But when reconnaissance aircraft photographed white water bursting from the spillways of the Schwammenauel Dam on February 9th, the entire operation halted. The Germans had opened the floodgates. Within hours, the Ruhr swelled 10 feet, its calm surface turning to brown turbulence. Engineers who had spent months calculating current speeds saw their math rendered useless. Every ponton test raft was swept away. Patrols reported the water running 20 miles an hour, carrying uprooted trees, barrels, and even dead livestock. One officer remarked bitterly, "We could bridge that river, but not that flood." General William Simpson, commanding the Ninth Army, postponed the crossing. He ordered his engineers to wait, measure, and prepare to move the instant the current fell below 6 feet per second. It became a waiting war, a duel between engineers and gravity. For 3 weeks the Roer raged, fed by thawing snow from the Eifel. The Germans believed they had bought themselves a month. They bought less than half of one. Behind the lines, engineer units drilled as if the crossing would begin every morning. They measured the banks with ice-coated tape, stockpiled ponton trucks on every approach road, and kept smoke generators idling to conceal the assembly areas. In some sectors, bulldozers worked under camouflage nets, scraping out approach ramps by night. The men learned to recognize the river's voice, the hiss and rumble of water easing down, the sign that time was turning in their favor. On February 23, 1945, the order came, "The Ruhr has dropped. Begin crossing." At dawn, the river was still a violent, swirling mass, but the engineers did not wait. The 1st and 9th Armies launched simultaneous assaults on a 40-mile front. Smoke rolled across the valley, thick as fog. The first waves went in infantry and plywood assault boats, paddling through the churn with grim concentration. Then the treadway trucks moved forward. Each M2 ponton, 22 feet long, was unrolled from its trailer and dragged into the water by bulldozers while German artillery bracketed the site. The first bridge went in near Linnich. It took only 2 hours from the first float to the first truck crossing. That was less time than the Germans had spent wiring their own demolitions. To protect the builders, the Americans turned science into weaponry. Barrage balloons hung over the river to disrupt strafing runs. Searchlights bounced beams off low clouds to create an artificial night. The chemical corps laid screens of white smoke 20 miles wide, replenished every 15 minutes by truck-mounted generators. An observer from the 83rd Infantry Division wrote, "The river looked like a moving factory. Engines, cranes, smoke, light, everything working at once. We were inside the machine." German sappers tried to answer with demolition shells and mortars. One round struck the Linnich treadway, cutting it cleanly in two. The engineers had a repair section waiting. Within 20 minutes, the gap was replaced and traffic resumed. At Jülich, an entire approach ramp collapsed under a tank column. Within 4 hours, engineers laid a new span 200 yards upstream. The speed stunned the enemy. Captured German combat engineers from the 275th Division later testified, "We could not destroy as fast as they could build. Each time our artillery hit a bridge, another appeared. By nightfall, 3 heavy ponton bridges, 4 treadways, and 5 infantry footbridges spanned the Ruhr. Over them flowed an unending line of armour and trucks, Shermans, tank destroyers, DUKWs, ambulances, jeeps, even mobile bakeries. The river that had been a weapon became a highway. In the command post, Major General John Anderson of the 16 Corps watched the status board fill with a single repeated word beside each crossing, "Open." He turned to his staff and said, "We have outrun their water." When German observers radioed that enemy bridging operations proceed in all sectors, despite fire, it was not an admission of defeat so much as recognition of inevitability. The Ruhr had been their last hope for time. The Americans had turned it into proof that time itself now belonged to them. By February 25th, engineer battalions had completed 10 bridges in 3 days, some over 300 feet long. In that same period, the Germans managed to blow 2 and lost both to rebuilt replacements before sunrise. In a post-war report, the U.S. Army Engineer Board called the Ruhr crossings a decisive demonstration that water obstacles had ceased to have tactical value. The data were precise and cold. Average construction time per treadway, 4 hours. Average delay from enemy action, 40 minutes. Average repair time, 25. Mathematics had replaced panic. The men who worked those rivers knew what it meant. Private First Class Daniel Roach wrote home, "We don't fight with guns, we fight with minutes." He was right. Across Europe, rivers had been Germany's last weapons. At the Roer, those weapons failed not because they lacked power, but because the Americans had learned to move faster than destruction itself. The river that had once stood between 2 armies became only another line on a map. The engineers packed their gear, turned their trucks east, and began preparing for the next name, the next crossing, the next race against the clock, Rhine. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was never meant to survive the war. Built in 1916 to carry supply trains across the Rhine, it stood between the twin towers of the Erpelallee, like a survivor from another age, rusted girders, cracked decking, and a single rail line patched by hasty repairs. By March of 1945, German engineers had already wired it for demolition. The Rhine was supposed to be the Reich's final shield, and Remagen one of its trapdoors. But when American engineers reached its banks, they found the door still open. On the morning of March 7, 1945, the lead elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division rolled down the hills south of Remagen. Ahead lay the Rhine, the barrier Hitler had promised would never be crossed. Through their field glasses, scouts saw the impossible, the Ludendorff Bridge still standing, its black trusswork silhouetted against the pale sky. Clouds of dust drifted where German troops retreated across it. A demolition charge had already detonated at one end, blowing a hole in the deck but leaving the structure intact. Major General John W. Leonard, commanding the division, called forward the 9th Armored's Engineer Detachment under Captain Carl H. Timmerman, a Nebraska farm boy turned combat commander. His orders were brief. If that bridge is there, take it. At 0300 hours, American tanks began shelling the far bank while combat engineers dashed down the approach road, cutting fuses and hauling away explosive charges. The Germans had laid over 6,000 pounds of TNT under the main spans, connected to multiple firing circuits. But something had gone wrong: wet detonators, cut lines, panic. As the first Sherman tank rumbled onto the deck, German sappers on the far side hit the plunger one last time. A dull thud, a flash, and a fountain of water, then silence. The charges failed. The bridge trembled but stood. The race was on. Engineers followed the tanks across, probing for live wires, tossing loose charges into the river, and marking holes in the deck with chalk for repair. German machine gun fire rattled from the cliffs above Erpel. American riflemen shot back from the bridge's steel lattice. The crossing became a firefight fought on a structure never designed for combat. Yet within 20 minutes, the first American platoon was across the Rhine. For the first time since Napoleon, an enemy army had crossed Germany's sacred river in force. Behind them, the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion moved with precision learned through years of rivers and wreckage. They rolled forward Bailey sections, wooden planks, welding torches and cables. The bridge shuddered under tank traffic, its girders flexing with each 50-ton load. Lieutenant Jack Hyde's engineer platoon crawled along the underside, welding patches to fractured beams while shells splashed into the river below. We worked in sparks and spray. Hyde later recalled, every time a tank crossed, we prayed it would make it. General Courtney Hodges of 1st Army sent a telegram to Eisenhower. Bridge intact at Remagen. Armor crossing. Situation developing rapidly. Eisenhower's reply was understated. Well done. Hold it. Holding it was the problem. Within hours, the Germans turned every available gun on the bridge. Artillery from both sides of the Rhine poured fire into the valley. Railroad guns, heavy mortars, even the first jet bombers attacked. The Luftwaffe launched Me-262s and Arado bombers with radio-guided missiles, the world's earliest precision weapons. But the engineers answered with mathematics repair schedules, counterweights, and traffic control. They reinforced girders with Bailey trusses, built timber cribs under weakened piers, and strung ponton bridges upstream to divert current pressure. When shells tore holes in the decking, replacement panels arrived within minutes from preloaded trucks. The Army called it bridge maintenance under combat conditions. The men doing it called it something else, patching hell. One private described working with his boots in water, smoke so thick he could taste the metal, sparks falling like rain. On March 10th, 3 days after the first crossing, the bridge had carried over 8,000 vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, trucks, ambulances, and bulldozers. German engineers finally managed to collapse one of the approach spans with a direct hit, but it was too late. The Americans had already built a Bailey bridge alongside it, carried on pontoons lashed together with steel cable. When the original Ludendorff Bridge finally fell on March 17th, killing 28 engineers, the Army barely paused. Traffic shifted to the new span in hours. The Rhine had been breached. Captured German officers were stunned. One told his interrogators, "That bridge was doomed. We wired it 12 times. You crossed as if it were a road in Kansas." The American engineer reply was simple. "We built faster than you could fail." The crossing at Remagen was more than a tactical success. It was a psychological earthquake. To the German people, the Rhine was eternal, the river that had stopped Caesar, Napoleon, and every invader since. Now, in less than 10 days, American engineers had crossed it, fortified it, and multiplied it. Within a week, they had completed 5 additional spans, 3 floating pontons, 1 bailey, 1 heavy treadway stretching across the river from Bonn to Mainz. Each new bridge meant another artery feeding the Allied advance into Germany's heart. A post-war report from the U.S. Army Engineer School would later summarize the Remagen miracle with characteristic understatement. The bridge at Remagen was a structural relic, captured intact through enemy error and preserved through engineer action under continuous fire. But that sterile phrasing missed the human truth. The Ludendorff bridge had lived 11 days longer than it should have, long enough to deliver 45,000 men and 5,000 vehicles across the Rhine. When the war ended 2 months later, the engineers who had welded, patched, and prayed over that bridge received a small bronze plaque reading simply, "They held it." It was the ultimate testament to the doctrine born in North Africa and refined through Sicily, Arnaville, and the Ruhr that in modern war, victory belonged not only to those who could destroy, but to those who could build faster than destruction itself. By the time spring thawed the banks of the lower Rhine, the engineers of the Allied armies were already building history. Remagen had been the miracle, an accident seized and held. But what came next was deliberate, a crossing planned with the precision of a factory shift, scaled to industrial proportions. Operation Plunder was not a single bridge, but a symphony of bridges, barges, smoke, and steel, all timed to the minute. It was the final proof that American and British engineers could turn a continent's widest river into a temporary highway. At 0200 hours on March 24, 1945, searchlights lit the Rhine between Wesel and Ries, their beams reflected in the black water like shattered glass. Artillery thundered from the west bank, 4,000 guns firing in unison, the largest bombardment in Europe since Normandy. Behind that wall of sound waited the river engineers of the U.S. 17th and British 79th Armoured Divisions, the 5th Engineer Special Brigade, and a dozen independent engineer battalions. Each man knew his task by heart. Assault boats first, smoke next, then the bridge trains. At 0230, the first wave launched. Assault boats, plywood and canvas stretched over aluminum frames, churned the Rhine under tracers and rocket glare. British commandos went first, their boats slicing through the water toward the eastern shore, followed by the men of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. German flares arced upward, bathing the scene in ghostly white. Machine gun fire clattered from pillboxes, but the gunners were already disoriented. Smoke generators on the west bank, burning a mix of oil and chlorosulfonic acid, poured out clouds so dense that visibility dropped to 10 yards. One engineer described it as working inside a thundercloud that stank of metal and rain. By dawn, hundreds of assault boats had made the crossing. Infantry clung to the far bank, digging foxholes into soft floodplain mud. The river engineers moved next, towing ponton trains into position. Each train consisted of 10 heavy M2 pontoons lashed side by side, each capable of bearing a tank. Bulldozers rolled forward to cut approach ramps through the embankment. Under constant shellfire, crews manhandled the first floats into the water. Major General Raymond McLean's XIEC Corps reported at 0800 hours. First treadway in water, Riesa, sector. That meant the bridging race had begun. German artillery was sporadic, but deadly when it hit. At one site, a shell burst destroyed an entire ponton bay, killing 8 engineers. The survivors dragged new floats forward and rebuilt the section in 20 minutes. Across the river, the infantry's radio code crackled. "We're across. Build fast." Speed had become doctrine. Every component of the Rhine operation was rehearsed in Belgium for weeks beforehand. Engineers had memorized bridge sequences like musicians reading notes: anchorage first, trestle second, decking third. Each action had a time standard. The ideal span 600 feet was to be completed in 6 hours or less. The men carried watches synchronized to the minute. The enemy could fire as much as they liked. The clock mattered more than the guns. The British engineers of the 15th Scottish Division finished the first-class 40 Bailey Bridge at Moselle by dusk, 650 feet of steel, carrying trucks before midnight. Nearby, American units laid their own Victory Bridge, a floating treadway over 900 feet long, built in 9 hours under smoke and artillery. Its first traffic was the armoured spearhead of the 9th Armoured Division, the same men who had seized Remagen 2 weeks earlier. German resistance crumbled with each new bridge. Field Marshal Model's Army Group B tried to shell the crossings, but Allied counter-battery fire silenced their guns. Luftwaffe attacks came sporadically, mostly jet bombers flying too high and too fast to aim. One Me-262 dropped bombs a full mile from its target. By nightfall, the Rhine was no longer a boundary. It was a worksite alive with floodlights, cranes, and engines humming across the water. A war correspondent from Stars and Stripes watched from the West Bank and wrote, "It looked like a city being born in one night. You could hear the river, the hammering, the shouted orders. Everything moved like clockwork, and all of it under fire." By March 25th, 6 separate bridges spanned the Rhine between Wesel and Ries, 3 Bailey, 2 Treadway, 1 heavy ponton. Each bore a name: Essex, Blackfriars, Bremen, Victory, MacArthur, Ironside. Together they carried the weight of 4 entire armies: British 2nd, Canadian 1st, and US 9th and 1st. In 24 hours, 40,000 vehicles crossed, from trucks and half-tracks to tanks and ambulances. German prisoners captured that morning stared at the bridges in disbelief. One was heard muttering, "It took us weeks to build one bridge. They build 6 overnight." The comparison was not exaggeration. Post-war records showed that the Wehrmacht never completed a single permanent span across the Rhine after 1944. To the engineers who made it happen, Operation Plunder was the culmination of everything learned since North Africa. Every lesson reconnaissance first, redundancy always, speed over perfection, had been distilled into one immense operation. They had mastered water, smoke, and timing. As dawn broke on March 26, 1945, bulldozers roared down the eastern ramps, clearing wreckage, while convoys rolled east toward the Ruhr. Behind them, on the western bank, the last engineer teams stood down. The river they had feared and studied for years now lay bridged from horizon to horizon. One sergeant wrote home that night, "It used to be the Rhine. Now it's just another road." What had begun in the deserts of North Africa with rubber boats and hand tools had ended with steel highways across Germany's greatest river. The engineers had learned a truth older than gunpowder. In the final reckoning, the army that builds faster than the enemy can destroy writes the map of victory. By April of 1945, the rivers had been conquered, but the roads ahead were broken. The Allied advance into the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany, moved faster than any supply system could follow. Tanks outpaced fuel trucks, artillery outdistanced its ammunition trains, and every road behind the front seemed choked with wreckage, craters, and refugees. It was an army stretched across a landscape of ruin, and it fell to the engineers to stitch it back together, mile by mile, under darkness and fire. The 1056th Engineer Combat Group, veterans of Normandy, the Moselle, and the Rhine, received its orders on April 5th. Reopen the Autobahn approaches to Essen and Dortmund. Keep traffic moving at all times. It sounded simple. In practice, it meant rebuilding entire sections of Germany's road network, while tanks rolled over the same ground, while towns burned, and while civilians swarmed the verges looking for safety. The mission was not glory, it was continuity, and it was carried out mostly at night. Daylight belonged to the bombers. The Ruhr was under constant attack by the 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command. Craters as wide as swimming pools scarred the Autobahn every few hundred yards. Bridges had been dropped into ravines. Rail lines lay twisted like vines. So the engineers worked under blackout, guided by the pale cones of truck headlights, hooded with slits of canvas. They called themselves Night builders. Captain Raymond L. Marsh of the 1056th described his first night outside Hagen. The air still smelled of cordite and limestone dust. We started at 2100 hours, cleared debris with dozers, then set Bailey panels by hand. We didn't speak much. Every few minutes you could hear artillery in the east, like thunder over the hills. They built fast because they had to. The infantry depended on them. The tanks depended on them. Even the field kitchens depended on them. A destroyed bridge meant starvation at the front within 24 hours. So the engineers worked in relay shifts 12 on, 6 off, though off usually meant sitting, by a generator drinking cold coffee while waiting for the next section of road to collapse. Every job followed the same rhythm: reconnaissance, marking, demolition of debris, assembly. A Bailey bridge could be built in 8 hours by 100 men working without pause. The record came on April 10th, when Company C of the 1056th threw a 200-foot Class 40 Bailey across the Lippe River in just 5 hours and 20 minutes, finishing minutes before the leading Shermans of the 2nd Armoured Division arrived. The tankers didn't even slow down. They crossed before the last pin was locked. The Germans fought as shadows, snipers, mines, and booby traps. Bridges wired with delayed fuses exploded behind advancing columns, and engineers were sent back to rebuild them before dawn. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, operating near Gelsenkirchen, rebuilt one bridge 4 times in 48 hours. They learned to detect mines by smell the bitter scent of picric acid mixed with wet earth. Private Ernest Connors wrote in his diary, "We fight the ground itself. It kills with wires, water, and wood." When steel ran short, the Americans turned scavengers. They tore beams from collapsed factories, cut rails from wrecked sidings, and melted German streetcar rails to make reinforcement rods. Every scrap became part of another bridge or culvert. The German civilians watched in stunned silence as, night after night, the Americans rebuilt what their own army had destroyed. An old woman in Essen told a U.S. interpreter, "Your soldiers build faster than ours can burn." At the forward depots, welding arcs lit the darkness like lightning storms. Mobile cranes swung Bailey panels into place while generators coughed black smoke. Over the din of engines came the sound of rivet guns and hammer blows, the steady heartbeat of construction. Fuel convoys waited at the approaches, headlights dimmed, until engineers waved them through. When the first truck crossed, the men cheered softly and went back to work. There was no ceremony, only movement. In the Ruhr, the engineers discovered a new kind of warfare, the logistics of momentum. The German defense was collapsing, but the terrain itself became the enemy: flooded mines, collapsed bridges, and cratered highways. The faster the Allies advanced, the more they had to rebuild behind them. In 2 weeks, the 1056th and its sister groups repaired 148 bridges, cleared 700 miles of road, and laid 400 miles of temporary track for supply trains. When the Ruhr pocket finally closed on April 18th, trapping 300,000 German troops, it was engineer roads that made the encirclement possible. The armoured pincers that met near Paderborn had travelled on bridges built less than 24 hours before. A staff officer later noted, "The German army was surrounded by our carpenters. After the surrender, the engineers kept working. They built prisoner cages, water points, and depots. They restored power to towns that had been dark for months. Their bridges still carried tanks, but now those tanks were hauling bread. By May 8th, when the guns fell silent, most of Germany's major river crossings stood on American steel and Bailey trusses." One after-action report summed up the engineers' role in a single line: "They did not conquer, they connected. That connection was victory itself." The night builders of the Ruhr had turned destruction into direction, forging a path of steel through the ruins of an empire. And somewhere, in the wet silence before dawn, a tired sergeant might have looked at his latest bridge and whispered the engineer's quiet creed, one that had begun on the beaches of North Africa and ended here, under a German sky streaked with fire and welding sparks: speed beats fuses. When the guns went silent on May 8, 1945, the engineers of the U.S. Army did not hear it as triumph. They heard it as permission to keep building. The same men who had bridged the Moselle under fire and crossed the Rhine under jet attack now faced a quieter kind of war, the war of repair. Germany lay in ruins, its rivers clogged with wreckage, its rail lines severed, and its bridges shattered or barely standing. The engineers' new mission was no longer destruction or advance, it was restoration. They were to rebuild a continent fast enough to prevent chaos. Colonel Emerson Itchner, whose 249th Engineer Combat Battalion had built the bridge at Arnaville, was among the first ordered to shift from combat to reconstruction. His unit, once trained to work by stopwatch under artillery fire, now worked under silence and uncertainty. The new orders came from Shaef Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Restore communications and river crossings essential to the movement of displaced persons, food, and relief supplies. The army that had once measured success in miles gained now, measured it in lives fed. The engineers began with the Rhine, the river they had fought so hard to cross. Of its 200 major bridges, none remained intact by May. Where once smoke and thunder marked battle, there were now barges filled with civilians, ox carts, and Red Cross convoys waiting for passage. The Americans built 12 military bridges across the river in the first 2 weeks, after victory, steel treadways and ponton spans laid by the same battalions that had ferried tanks a month earlier. They became bridges to peace, carrying food, doctors, and relief columns instead of artillery. In towns like Cologne, Koblenz, and Mainz, engineers worked side by side with captured German sappers, many of them astonished at their captors' speed. A German lieutenant taken prisoner at Remagen was assigned to assist an American bridge crew in June. His diary, later translated by the Allied translator and interpreter section, recorded his disbelief. They rebuild as we breathe. At night they sleep on steel girders. They seem unable to stop. The work was not only mechanical, it was moral. Every new bridge restored a little order to a landscape that had forgotten it. Refugees streamed back across the Rhine, millions of them, many barefoot, many pushing carts made of scavenged wood. Engineers built ponton ferries to shuttle families across. When Bailey panels ran short, they used telephone poles and salvaged I-beams. Some of the same treadways that had carried Sherman tanks now carried children and milk trucks. In Bavaria, the 371st Engineer Construction Battalion reopened the Isar River crossings within 10 days of the surrender. The men joked that they were fighting entropy instead of Hitler. But their work was deadly serious. Without bridges, food could not move, and without food, order would collapse. The engineers understood this instinctively. They had learned in North Africa that logistics was survival. Now, in victory, logistics was mercy. Meanwhile, the Army Corps of Engineers turned its wartime genius for improvisation into a peacetime blueprint. The Bailey Bridge, invented in Britain and perfected in America, became the foundation of Europe's recovery. Over 2,000 Bailey spans remained in service across the continent by year's end, some lasting decades. They became symbols of resilience, steel skeletons that outlived the men who assembled them in mud and fire. On May 27, 1945, General Eisenhower visited a construction site near Frankfurt, where engineers were erecting a new heavy bridge to replace one destroyed by retreating Germans. He stood on the bank, watched as cranes lifted prefabricated trusses into place, and said quietly, "We won the war because we could cross anything." The remark was simple, but every man there understood its weight. By June, the engineers were building not only bridges but nations. They restored power stations, laid pipelines, and constructed temporary housing for millions of displaced civilians. The 1056th Engineer Combat Group, which had built under shellfire in the Ruhr, now supervised refugee camps, turning abandoned Wehrmacht depots into orderly towns. Their bulldozers leveled ground for gardens. Their cranes lifted roof beams instead of Bailey panels. In their after-action reports, Many officers expressed the same sentiment, that war had taught them to measure success not by destruction achieved, but by the speed of recovery afterward. Lieutenant Colonel Harold B. Whiting wrote in his final report, "Our job was to prove that civilization can be rebuilt faster than it can be wrecked. That is the only true victory an engineer understands." When summer came, the rivers of Europe ran clear again. The Rhine shimmered with reflections of new bridges, some military, some civilian, all built by men who had learned that structure could defeat chaos. The Germans had once called these men Brückenmänner, bridgemen. Now the name carried a different meaning. They were not just the builders of spans and roads. They were the architects of stability, the custodians of a fragile peace built on steel, timber, and will. As one sergeant wrote home in June 1945, standing beside a Bailey bridge that now carried Red Cross convoys, "When we came here, the bridges were made to kill. Now they carry bread. That's all the difference in the world." In the end, the story of the American engineers was not about victory through destruction, it was about victory through construction. They had learned the hard way, across the deserts, the rivers, and the ruins, that speed beat fuses, and that to build faster than the world could fall apart was the truest measure of power. The rivers of war had become the roads of peace, and across every span of steel, the echo of hammers told the quiet truth of how the war was won. In the months after the surrender, the engineers drifted home by the thousands by troopship, train, or not at all. Their work had no parades, no headline battles, no cinematic victories. Yet wherever the Allied armies had gone, the ground still bore their signature: riveted trusses, treadway bolts, bridge plaques stamped U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Across Europe, from the Po Valley to the Weser, their structures outlasted the smoke and the flags. It was easy to forget that the empire of steel and motion which carried victory to Berlin had been built by men with wrenches and welding torches instead of rifles. When the demobilization began in late 1945, the engineer battalions dissolved as quietly as they had worked. The 249th, 291st, and 1056th Combat Engineer Group's units, whose names had once been whispered with respect by armoured divisions and truck companies, turned in their tools, signed their final supply forms, and vanished into the paperwork of peace. But their bridges did not vanish. The Ludendorff at Remagen was gone, collapsed under the strain of victory, yet the Bailey span that replaced it remained open until 1951. The Arnaville Bridge over the Moselle carried traffic into the 1960s. Even in rural France, farmers crossed small timber trestles built from surplus Bailey panels, each stamped "Property of U.S. Army, 1944. In Washington, the Corps of Engineers turned its wartime momentum into a philosophy. The war had proven that engineering was not just a support arm, it was a weapon system. In briefings to Congress, General Eugene Raybould, Chief of Engineers, presented statistics that read like artillery tables. In the European theatre, engineers constructed over 15,000 bridges exceeding 100 feet, totaling more than 4 million square feet of roadway. The average bridge lifespan under combat conditions was 6 days. The average replacement time, under fire, was 6 hours. He paused, then added quietly, "Our bridges lasted just long enough for victory." Back in the United States, veterans of the engineer units struggled to explain what they had done. There were no medals for fastest treadway under shellfire, no campaigns named for pontoons or smoke generators. Yet in reunion halls and VFW basements, they kept photographs, black and white prints of skeletal bridges vanishing into fog, men knee-deep in rivers tightening bolts by hand. Each photo was a story told without boasting. "That's the Moselle," one might say. "We built it twice in one night." The engineers' war had been mathematical and muscular, a contest of minutes and metal, but it had also been deeply human. They built not to destroy, but to connect towns, armies, and, in the end, nations. Their doctrine of engineer reconnaissance first had evolved into a principle of governance. Look before you act, plan before you move, build before you fight. In post-war Germany, that logic became policy. The U.S. Army Corps oversaw the reconstruction of roads, canals, and flood defenses. The Rhine, once a frontier of death, became the lifeline of the Marshall Plan. German engineers who had once fought against them now worked beside them. In 1946, at a reconstruction conference in Frankfurt, a former Wehrmacht bridge officer named Major Franz Keller stood and addressed an audience of Allied and German engineers. His words were translated and printed in the Engineer Bulletin. In 1943, we laughed at your bridges. We said you built too heavy, too slow, too wide. In 1945, we realized we had built too little. You taught us that strength is not in the span, it is in the speed with which men decide to build. Across the Atlantic, the American public began to see the engineers' legacy, not just in Europe, but at home. Veterans returned to civilian life and took their skills with them. They became road builders, dam designers, and city planners. Many joined the Bureau of Reclamation or state highway departments. The same men who had thrown pontoons across the Rhine now laid the foundations for post-war America's interstate highways. One could trace a straight line from the Bailey Bridge at Moselle to the concrete overpasses that would rise across the United States in the 1950s. The engineers' legacy also survived in their language. Phrases born in the mud and water of war entered textbooks and doctrine. Hold what you build, speed beats fuzes, reconnaissance before repair. Each motto carried the memory of men who measured time in seconds under fire. Yet for all their accomplishments, few engineers saw themselves as heroes. At the 1946 reunion of the 56th Engineer Battalion, a sergeant from Arnaville summed up their modest creed. We weren't warriors, we were problem solvers. We didn't win battles, we made them possible. The final official report of the U.S. Army Engineer Command, published in late 1946, ended not with statistics, but with a single paragraph that read like an epitaph. In this war, as in no other, the engineer proved that the power to build is the power to endure. His bridges carried the armies of democracy not only across rivers, but across the boundaries of time and destruction. The weapons of engineers are structure, motion, and resolve. Their victories are measured in connections made and kept. Long after the last Bailey panel rusted away, that truth remained. The war had begun, with armies destroying bridges to delay pursuit, and ended with engineers building them to carry bread. Between those two moments lay the true revolution of modern warfare, the realization that progress, not annihilation, was the final measure of strength. By 1946, as the rivers of Europe ran quietly beneath their spans, the engineers' war was over. But every truck, every train, every convoy that crossed their work carried forward the echo of their hammers, a reminder that civilization itself rests on the courage to build faster than the world can fall apart.